The question is, when I first became aware of my spiritual longing, I found a guru and read many books that talk about a spiritual path. So I followed that for a number of years and did everything described as the procedure for making progress. But I came to a point where I felt I wasn't growing, and I then found a non-dual teacher who not only denies that there's a path to enlightenment, but even says it is dangerous to have the concept of a path because it can directly block your awakening. So I followed that for several years, but now I again feel like I'm not growing, and this has become quite a challenge for me because I don't know where to turn next. I have followed the path and I have attempted to awaken from the dream, but none of it has worked. I wonder if you have anything to say about this. Is the concept of a path dangerous for enlightenment? So I know I have just given another answer to a similar question about whether there's a path to enlightenment. But I feel that this question goes a little bit in a different direction, so it opens up some other perspectives. So I felt there was something to say about this. And so let's take the question, is the concept of a path dangerous for seekers, for those who want enlightenment? And I can answer that question very clearly. Yes and no. And the reason is that you can't give a yes or no answer to a question like this because it's too simplistic. In other words, it's too simplistic to say that the concept of a path is dangerous to enlightenment and will block you enlightenment because there's more to say about it. So we have to step back and look at for a wider perspective. And there's different levels of this. But let's just start with something fairly simple, an analogy. And let's look at Zeno's paradox. Zeno was an ancient Greek philosopher. Actually, he wasn't ancient. He was a philosopher in ancient Greece. But he presented this paradox. And to describe it, let's say that you are in Washington, D.C., and you decide, I want to go to New York. In fact, I not only want to go to New York, I want to walk to New York. You know it's a long way, but you also know it can be done, you know. And so Zeno would say, yeah, you can start walking, but you'll never arrive. And the reason is that first you have to go to the halfway point, and then you have to go to the halfway point of the remaining distance. And you can keep dividing the remaining distance in half without ever arriving. And this is, in a sense, this is what some of these non-dual teachers have seen about the concept of a spiritual path. But they're not the only ones who've seen it. I mean, spiritual teachers going way back have seen the same thing. Because the simple fact is that any concept that's given, that's expressed in words, can be interpreted and disinterpreted by people. So basically you could say people can screw up anything. There's no guaranteed method for teaching people how to reach a higher level of consciousness, because anything can be misused. So what you can say is that you can observe, and I've observed this for many, many years in the spiritual movements I've been aware of. There's a certain group of students that come into a spiritual movement and they sit there. And the guru is up there on the stage teaching, and there are other people that are actively engaged in the movement that are doing various things to make the movement function. But there's a certain group of people that just want to sit there. They don't want the guru to notice them. They don't want other people to notice them. And when they go out of the movement, they don't want to talk to anybody about their spiritual beliefs. They just want to be anonymous. And I'm not blaming them. I'm just observing that this is the case. And what can happen to these people is that they go into a state of mind where they feel very comfortable because they're on the spiritual path. But they also see themselves as being perpetual students. We are going to continue to walk the spiritual path. We're never going to arrive anywhere. It's kind of like a person who goes to a university and he studies for 4 years. But he doesn't want to go to the final exam. Instead, he enrolls in another 4-year course. Because he doesn't want to get a degree, because then he has to go out in the real world and get a job and take responsibility for his life. He just wants to remain in this comfortable environment. And that's what happens to some people who find a spiritual movement. And again, I'm not blaming them, because obviously they need to be there for a while to have some kind of healing, whatever that is individually. So I'm not trying to blame them. I'm just saying this is what some of these non-dual teachers and other spiritual teachers over the ages have observed, that there are these students who become perpetual students. And in a sense, you could say that what the non-dual teachers are doing, they're trying to shock these people out of their inertia and get them to grow. Like the question says, the person followed this concept of a spiritual path for a while and then felt that he or she wasn't growing. So this can happen to people. It doesn't have to happen. I mean, I met plenty of people who are following a path and they are continuing to grow. But there are certainly some that stop and then they get comfortable and this. So you can say that these non-dual teachers are trying to shock people out of this. Now, I would, in a sense, say, well, why would you want to shock people out of it? If they need that experience, let them have it. But that's just my approach. So, so does that mean that they are right, these non-dual teachers? Well, again, yes and no. For some people, it may help them to be shocked. And it may help them to think about what they have done with this concept of a spiritual path. Does it trap them or doesn't it? But what some of the non-dual teachers are doing is they are going from what I call one extreme to another, where they are saying, yes, I see there's a problem with the spiritual path, therefore we should completely abandon the concept of a spiritual path. But to me, that's not the highest approach. That's like saying, cars cause accidents. People die in car accidents. We should abandon cars. Instead of saying we should find a way to make cars more safe, driving more safe, so we can avoid the accidents. That's how we, in my opinion, make progress, you know. But let's go back to Zeno's paradox. Okay? So what the non-dual teachers are in a way saying is you can't arrive at the Empire State Building in New York by walking. So here you are, here's a non-dual teacher, he's standing on top of the Empire State Building, and when he awakened, he found himself on top of the Empire State Building. And you're talking to him on the phone, you are standing in front of Lincoln Memorial in DC, and he's saying to you, give up this idea of walking and taking one step at a time. Just switch your mind, awaken from the dream, and you'll find yourself here on the Empire State Building with me. And my response is, if you can believe that, if you can believe that this teacher has found some way that will transport you from DC to New York in one giant leap for mankind, if you believe this, keep following that teacher. That's obviously what you need to do. You need that experience. But as the question describes, here was a person who followed such a spiritual teacher and still, after a while, came to a point that this isn't really getting me anywhere either. So if that's you, then let's take another look here. Again, Zeno's paradox. What's the solution to Zeno's paradox? Well, it is to say that for a time it's actually correct. You have to walk to the halfway point of the remaining distance, and then to the halfway point, and then to the halfway point. But if you keep doing this, there comes a point where now you are standing there in front of the door to the Empire State Building, and if you take one full step, you are inside. You've arrived. So why would you at that point say, but I can't take a full step, I have to take a half a step, and then a quarter of a step, and then an eighth of a step? The paradox is valid up to a point, but there comes a point where it just becomes ridiculous. I'm just going to take that final step and I've arrived. And this is, in a sense, what the non-dual teachers are saying, just take that final step. But what they're not acknowledging is you can't take the final step directly from DC to New York. And this is what Zeno's paradox says. Because if you hadn't taken all of these steps, if you hadn't walked to the halfway point and then the halfway point, then you wouldn't have gotten there where now you can take one step and arrive. So what I'm saying is, there is validity to following a spiritual path. because it brings you closer to the point where now you can take one final step and you have arrived somewhere. I will later talk about where you have arrived at, but you've broken through. You have gotten to a point where you can say, I have definitely achieved results from my spiritual pursuits. And so you see what I'm saying? Denying that there's a path to follow. There can be some people that are at that point where they can make a final shift and then they break through. But for most people, there will be some ways away from the point where they can make that shift. And in telling them that you should be making that shift, it's just kind of, first of all, it's, like I said in the other answer, giving them an impossible goal, but it's also putting a guilt trip on them. Because obviously, you're not good enough to make that final shift. But it's not that you're not good enough. It's not a matter of being good enough or better. You're just at a certain level of the path. And you just keep taking one step at a time. Like I described the path, you overcome these separate selves, these illusions. And if you keep doing that, there comes a point where they're not pulling on the conscious you anymore, and suddenly the conscious you can step outside and you can stop identifying yourself with the outer personality. And that is what I would call a major breakthrough on the path. But is that enlightenment? That's the next question. And so the problem I have when you say the spiritual path is dangerous and it can block your enlightenment, the problem I have with that statement is the word enlightenment. There were many years ago, I realized that the word soul had become useless because everybody is talking about the soul. But nobody was defining what they mean. So when you look at this, you could find 157 different groups or teachers or books that talked about soul, but they each had their own definition of soul. But everyone was expecting that when they said soul, everybody else would interpret the word soul the way they did. And since people didn't, they were just talking past each other. And it's almost like it became meaningless to use the word. And it's the same with enlightenment, because you look at some of these teachers that talk about enlightenment, and very few of them attempt to define it. Some even say it can't be defined. But is that really helpful to say that? Because if you tell people there's a goal you should strive towards, enlightenment, but you don't define what it is, how are they going to get there? How are they going to know whether they're there or not? And so this leads to this culture in some of these movements that you're just supposed to know what enlightenment is. And you're supposed to strive for it. And obviously the guru who talks about it, he has attained or she has attained enlightenment. So now everybody looks up to the guru, and when the guru says something that people don't understand, they don't really want to question it, because obviously it shows that they're inferior to the guru. They haven't reached the same level that the guru has reached, and that's why they can't understand what he's saying. And so nobody's willing to question, well, does what he's saying actually make sense? And so what I would say about this is that the real problem I have with the way many of these gurus use the word enlightenment is that they present it as a final state of consciousness. This is not just the modern non-dual teachers. You can actually go back, probably go even all the way back to the Vedas. There is a final state of consciousness you can achieve here on earth. And as I've said in some of the other videos, I just don't find that concept useful, and I don't find it in accordance with reality. It's certainly not in accordance with my experience. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that there's validity to the path, but there's also pitfalls to the idea of a path. There's validity to the concept of enlightenment, but there's also pitfalls, because it's a matter of how you interpret it. What do you do with it in your mind? And it's correct that you can take the concept of a spiritual path and you could turn it into a block, because you're seeing yourself, I'm on a student, I'm on the way, but by the very concept that you're on the way, you obviously haven't arrived. On the other hand, there are those who use the concept of enlightenment to say, I have now arrived, I am enlightened. And now they think this is the final stage. They don't need to question anything, they don't have any illusions left. And again, this blocks their growth. So either way, it can block your growth. You can't just say the path blocks your growth, but enlightenment or awakening doesn't. Because both can be interpreted in ways that block your growth. And so what I'm saying is, first of all, we need to understand the duality consciousness. I've said it over and over again, I will keep saying it. If you are talking about non-duality, you need to understand how the duality consciousness affects the way we look at things. And as I have said, in the duality consciousness, I have one of my breakthrough videos where I talk about the compensation games, but I have other videos where I talk about the same thing. We go into separation. We go into this illusion that we are separate beings instead of being connected to the one mind. And we feel incomplete, we suffer, and we want to get out of suffering. And we think, and in reality, the way to get out of suffering is to reconnect and overcome these subconscious selves we have created based on duality. That's the way to escape suffering. But in duality, we can't see that. We can't see, in duality, we can't see getting out of duality as a solution, because we actually can't see duality. We think this is just the way it is. You know, the way we look at things, that's the way they are. And so what we're trying to do in order to compensate is we're trying to create this worldview, and we want to elevate it to the status of being the highest possible, absolute, the ultimate truth. And you can do that with any concept, any idea. You can even do it with a concept of enlightenment. If enlightenment is a concept, you can say, this is the final truth, and enlightenment is the final state of consciousness. And this is exactly what the ego wants. This is exactly what the dualistic selves want. They want you to think that a dualistic self represents the ultimate truth, because then how are you ever going to get free of that dualistic self? You're going to keep feeding it your energy, and the self is going to continue to survive, which is all it can really think about doing. So, so what I'm saying is that when you understand duality, you understand that really the first stage of the process of spiritual growth, awakening, or enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, the first stage is to escape duality, is to raise yourself above the dualistic consciousness and shed these dualistic illusions. And I have described the process that the core of your being is the conscious you. And the reason we are suffering is we are pulled into these subconscious selves that we have created in reaction to situations on earth, often very traumatic situations. So in past lives, or in this life, we were exposed to these traumas, and we created these subconscious selves to make it seem livable. And they have both energy and they have an illusion, so they're pulling on the conscious you to step into these selves, and then you're looking at the world through those selves, but you suffer. It inevitably leads to tension and suffering. I've explained this in several other videos. So what can happen is, if you take a gradual approach and remove one of these selves at a time, and you have to take a gradual approach because you can't remove them all at once, no matter what anybody says. If you take a gradual approach and remove these separate selves, there can come a point where now the pull on the conscious you has become so low that suddenly it steps outside of its normal state of awareness, and it has this mystical, intuitive, non-dual experience. And it can feel like you have no self because you don't have your normal sense of self, but it's what many people call awakening. And this is a significant turning point in your life. It's a before and after. There's no going back. But what happens to many people is that they think this is the same as awakening. I have now awakened. I'm enlightened. This is the final stage. And you can actually find some very good videos out there by people who have described how they've gone through this process, and then they came to realize that it wasn't the final stage. I've gone through that process, but I just never believed, because I had some different spiritual teachings than most people have. I never believed it was the final stage. I always knew there was more illusions, you know. So, so what I'm saying is that when you stop fully identifying yourself with the outer personality and the subconscious selves that you have left, it becomes much easier to get rid of the rest, but only if you're willing to look at it. So if you go into the state where you think, now I'm enlightened, there's nothing to look at, you cannot overcome these separate selves. And that's why after a while you can feel you're stagnating again. You know, like the question describes, what many other people have described the same thing. They followed these non-dual gurus for a while, and then they realized, I'm not getting anywhere. In fact, I'm actually, in a sense, going backwards, because this leads to various problems. And so what I'm saying is that the higher approach to this is to realize that there is validity to the spiritual path. But there's also the danger that you can become comfortable at a certain level and you can stagnate. And if you are honest with yourself, like the person asking the question, then you can become aware of that. And if you become aware of that, you can realize it's not a matter of abandoning the idea that there's a spiritual path, but it's a matter of looking at the way you have conceived of the spiritual path, and then finding a teaching that can stimulate you to take a higher approach to the spiritual path. There are many out there. You know, you just need to find something that resonates with you. I don't have the attitude that everybody should accept the way I describe it. If what I say resonates with you, then take advantage of it. If it doesn't, then look for something else, some other teaching that can stimulate the process of you rethinking the spiritual path or re-experiencing the spiritual path, so that it's meaningful to you and it helps you grow. But I think it's, you know, very, very prudent to say that no matter what experience I've had, no matter how dramatic it felt, there's still some illusions left that I haven't seen. And why should you say that? Because you're still in physical embodiment, right? You wouldn't be watching this if you weren't in a physical body. And as long as you're in a physical body on a low planet like Earth, an unnatural planet like Earth, you have not reached the ultimate state of consciousness. It's just not possible. And thinking that it is, in my opinion, spiritual pride. It's just spiritual arrogance. I mean, look at the planet. No, but I'm not saying this from a theoretical standpoint, because I have had these experiences of stepping outside my normal sense of self and experiencing connecting to beings in the spiritual realm. I call them ascended masters, and I have connected with them thousands of times. And when you connect to the presence, the mind, the being of an ascended master, you realize, you experience. It's not a matter of theorizing, you just experience. This being has a consciousness that is much higher than mine. So there's no way you can think you have the ultimate state of consciousness. And I had an experience back in the 1990s where I felt that I connected to the Creator, just for a brief second. But I also realized this was a conscious being, but the consciousness was just so much higher than my own. And as I've explained, we start out with a point-like sense of self, and we have the potential to expand our sense of self, transcend the self, until we reach the Creator consciousness. But I just experienced that is way up there compared to where I'm at. So how could I possibly think that I have reached some ultimate state of consciousness here on Earth? So what I'm saying is, if people think they have reached an ultimate state of consciousness, they just haven't connected to something, they haven't experienced something that's beyond the level of consciousness that's possible on Earth. And that's why they They allow themselves to think that this is ultimate. And I understand that you can have a dramatic experience, you know. You can feel like this is so different from your normal state of consciousness, but it's still not ultimate. And the problem I have with it is, again, if you think you have reached an ultimate state of consciousness, you're stopping your growth. You're stagnating. It's the ultimate stagnation. You know, you can look at people and say that, like the Buddha said, most people are in ignorance. They're blinded by Maya. And you can say they're stuck there. Yeah. But nobody is more stuck than a person who thinks he's enlightened, but still has some illusions left. Because he's not even, he doesn't even think he needs to look at anything. Now, maybe the people who are really in ignorance don't think that either, but my point is, you know, you are actually more stuck when you think you have arrived at some ultimate state. So, okay, what is enlightenment? And there are some spiritual teachers who say it can't be defined. And in a sense, you could say, yeah, that's correct enough. You can't define it with words or concepts. But that doesn't mean you can't say something about it. So what I would say about enlightenment is that, well, first of all, it has these stages. You know, there is, you could say, if you want to say it simply, enlightenment is overcoming ignorance. But what is ignorance? Is it that you don't know anything? No. Ignorance is actually what I have talked about, that when the Creator created the creation and decided to send individual extensions of itself into the world of form and give them free will, he knew that people could be lost. Beings could be lost in the world of form because they came to identify with form. So in order to make it possible for people to come back to realizing they were extensions of the Creator, he first created the one mind. We can also call it the Christ mind or the Buddha nature. So the Creator created this one mind, and every form is created out of that mind, which means that looking at any form, you can come to see the one mind behind it. And therefore, wherever you are at, however far you have gone into identification with form, you can start going back out of that identification. So ignorance is ignorance that you are an extension of the one mind, that the one mind is within you, and that you can connect to the one mind and reach higher levels of connection until you start feeling one with the one mind. So this is ignorance. So enlightenment is overcoming ignorance. And the first stage of overcoming ignorance is to overcome what I call the duality consciousness, these dualistic illusions that make it seem like you are a separate self. And so you can come to that point, and sometimes it can be a dramatic experience where you at least temporarily step outside of these subconscious selves you have that makes you feel like a separate being. And I understand that this can be a dramatic experience. I've also had dramatic experiences on the spiritual path, but I just never really thought that they were the ultimate experience. But I understand that I can see that you can come to think this way. But then, to me, thinking that you have had an ultimate experience is thinking. It's an interpretation of the experience. And that's still in the mind, and that's still a form of ignorance. So, what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that the first step of overcoming ignorance is to get out of duality, to let go of this sense that you are a separate self. Then when you let go of the sense that you are a separate being, you start seeing yourself as a connected being. And you're connected to your higher self, you're connected to your spiritual teachers, the ascended masters in the spiritual realm. And ultimately, you can come to see that you're connected to the entire hierarchy of ascended beings that leads up to the Creator. And then, as you expand your sense of connection, you can come to a stage where now you're not just feeling connected to the one mind, you realize you are out of the one mind, or you are the one mind. But here's the subtlety. When I say you can become one with the one mind, I don't mean it the same way as they, as far as I can tell, mean it in the Vedas or the Vedantic tradition, or even these modern non-dual teachers. Because becoming one with the one mind doesn't mean that you stop existing as an individual self. It doesn't mean that you become the totality of the one mind. You are still seeing yourself as an individual being. It's just not a separate being. You know that you are out of the one mind, and you have a sense that you are that one mind expressing itself through you. Like Jesus said, I can of my own self do nothing. The Father, but in me, he doeth the work. And so, in a way, you could say that that's enlightenment. But if you, with enlightenment means the final stage, then I wouldn't say this is enlightenment. Because you very clearly experience you're still on Earth. It's a low planet. You still have illusions to overcome. You still have steps to walk on the path until you get to that final stage, the 144th level, where you can then graduate from Earth. You're overcoming the final illusion. You are taking that look back at Earth like the Buddha sitting under the bo tree, and you are experiencing there's nothing I want to do on Earth, there's nothing I want to experience, nothing pulls me back here, so I'm going to leave the Earth behind permanently forever. And that's the ascension. But again, this doesn't mean you stop existing as a self. It actually means you rise to a higher level of self. And in the ascended realm, you can keep transcending yourself until you go up to that greater consciousness. And that's how you, whatever you want to call it, that's how you reach what could be considered the ultimate level of consciousness in our world of form. But there's something even beyond that. I don't know what it is. I haven't experienced it, but I'm just saying, the separate mind wants to believe that there's an ultimate stage. But when you start uniting with the one mind, you realize there is ongoing, indefinite self-transcendence. And the linear mind always wants, but it must be an ultimate level. It must stop sometime. It must have started sometime. Really? Does it? That's what you can't grasp through the separate mind, but you can grasp it when you start experiencing that, the one mind, because the one mind is about transcendence, self-transcendence. And in a sense, you could say that, getting back to this, is the path dangerous for enlightenment? If this concept of a spiritual path causes you to look outside yourself instead of looking inside yourself, then it is dangerous to enlightenment. But if the concept of non-duality and that there is no path and that you just need to spontaneously awaken from the dream, if that keeps you from looking inside yourself, then that is equally dangerous to your enlightenment, because enlightenment can only be attained by looking inside yourself. Why are you not enlightened now? Because all of these separate selves, these dualistic selves, they're causing you to look outside yourself. How will you become enlightened? How will you switch from being enlightened from not enlightened to enlightened? By looking inside yourself and discovering the one mind and accepting that you are the one mind. But you are still an individual being growing in the one mind.